Hello and welcome to another breakdown video where we will be smashing through 4 of the most interesting fights taking place this weekend at UFC on ESPN Plus 21 live from Moscow. So in this video we will be breaking down the fights between Calvin Kattar and Zabit Magomedsharipov, as well as Greg Hardy versus Alexander Volkov. And if you like this video, please hit the like button below. It would really help the channel grow. I would really appreciate it. And also, if you haven't subscribed already, please hit the subscribe button for plenty of breakdown videos that come to you every week for every single UFC event, where we take a deep dive into these fights specifically from a betting perspective. So the very first fight that I want to talk about in today's video is going to be Anthony Rocco Martin versus Ramazan Emeev. And I mean, on a card full of so many, debutants, inexperienced fighters, low-level fighters, this matchup embedded within the middle of the UFC Moscow card, it's almost like an oasis in the middle of a desert, because it is a very competitive fight, a very, very decent fight between two skilled athletes. And immediately when I was scanning through all of the fights taking place this weekend, this is the fight that jumped out at me as, aside from the main event, probably the fight with possibly the best betting opportunities, because both guys have had a decent amount of fights in the UFC, so we can study their fights, get a really good read on how they're likely to perform this weekend. And I've got to be honest, Ramazan Emeev has looked very, very good in the UFC so far, so he was one of the first names that jumped out at me. So before we get into talking about this fight, how these guys match up from a stylistic point of view, let us take a look at the odds. So currently, Anthony Rocco Martin, his odds, I believe, have started to decline in the last 24 hours. So he's currently around about an average of 2.30, which is plus 130 for an implied probability of 43%. So in order to bet on Anthony Rocco Martin here, you'd really want to give him around about a 50% chance of winning to get any value from the betting sites. And then if we take a look at the odds on Ramazan Emeev, he is currently around about an average of 1.67, which is minus 149 for an implied probability of 60%. So to bet on Emeev, you've got to be looking to give him a 65% or better chance of winning. When we look at the odds, though, it does appear that money's coming in on Rocco. I mean, you can see the red arrow next to his odds on the majority of betting sites. It looks like in the last 24 hours, his odds have started to decline, whereas Emeev, his odds are starting to improve. So if you are thinking of betting Martin this week, now is probably a good time to do it, because his odds are starting to decline. If you want to bet Emeev, I would probably wait a little bit, because it looks like his odds are improving. So from a technical point of view, this should be a very competitive fight. I mean, a lot of people will be assuming Emeev is Russian, but I don't actually believe he is from Russia. It says that his nationality is Russia here, but I'm sure that he's from Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, somewhere like that. They have recently changed his nationality on on Tapology, but I know that he was previously listed as coming from one of the countries in the old Soviet Union. He isn't actually from Russia. But it's, if he is coming out with the Russian shorts, the Russian flag, if he is adopting that Russian nationality, possibly means he has home advantage this weekend against Rocco Martin, which of course could be a very big deal in a close competitive fight, because I do believe it's likely that this fight will be close and competitive, which means, if the fight does end up being close, Emeev's home advantage might tip the balance. But I'm not 100% sure if he is Russian, even though it says that he is here. So the reason why Emeev was one of the first names that jumped out at me is quite simply because he does have, probably home advantage, and he's very good everywhere. Very, very technical kickboxer. Razor sharp, crisp technique. So it's a nice diverse range of strikes. Also quite difficult to take down, quite difficult to hold down. And like most of these combat sambo guys, can definitely handle himself on the ground. But going back and watching Emeev's most recent fights against guys like Stefan Sekulic, Mina, Sam Alvey, Anatoly Tokov, one of the criticisms that I do have of Emeev is that, like a lot of these combat sambo guys, he can be quite passive, and that is basically the reason why he only just scraped through with a majority decision against Anatoly Tokov. If you go back and watch this fight from M1 Challenge 73, you will see that Emeev is one of these guys that there's no doubt that he's excellent everywhere, but he just at times struggles to pull the trigger. He is one of these combat sambo guys that sometimes doesn't show enough urgency, sometimes fails to put his stamp on rounds. So that is a slight concern, particularly with the way that MMA judges are, because obviously we can't assume he's going to have home advantage here. Perhaps the judges in Russia on Saturday will be very, very good. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if you're betting on a guy like Emeev at favourite odds, even if he does win the fight, he's also got to beat the judges. We know how bad the judges are in MMA. And just the point I'm trying to make is Emeev doesn't always do a very good job of putting his stamp on rounds, which is a bit of a concern. Even if he edges Martin by a little bit in each of the rounds, he's one of these guys where you can never feel totally confident the judges are going to score a fight in his favour just because of how passive he is. So that's definitely something to bear in mind if you want to bet Emeev this weekend. I personally feel like it's a little bit of a risk to bet on him as a favourite, just because he just doesn't do enough to really put his stamp on things. So in terms of Rocco Martin, what he brings to the table, a couple of years ago, 18 months ago, moved to Florida to train at American Top Team. But we really haven't seen too much of those improvements yet, because obviously it was a very difficult fight against Damian Maia, a fight where not a lot happened, a fight where he was controlled for the majority of the first 2 rounds of that fight. So looking forward to seeing how he shows up and performs on Saturday night. In terms of how these guys match up from a stylistic point of view, there's absolutely no question in my mind that Ramazan Emeev is a significantly better striker. Now, he's certainly got superior striking technique to Anthony Rocco Martin, but what Martin may lack in technique, and I'm certainly not criticising Martin's technique at all, he's very, very good, just not as technical as Emeev, but what he may lack in technique compared to Emeev, he can more than make up for in volume and aggression and activity, because like I said, Emeev is a little bit passive. Even if this fight stays standing, it's definitely possible that Martin could get the edge in some of the rounds just by being the more active fighter, just by landing more. He is definitely second best when it comes to technique, but he can make it close. Now, on the ground, Rocco Martin does have a huge advantage. I mean, you think of these combat sambo guys, guys that look like Ramazan Emeev, and you automatically think they're going to be amazing grapplers. And for the most part, Emeev is a very good grappler. Difficult to take down, difficult to hold down, can definitely handle himself on the ground. But Rocco Martin is a very, very high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. I mean, he hung on the ground for 3 rounds with Damian Maia, which is super duper impressive. So when you look at this fight, even though Martin does have an advantage on the ground, I'm not sure if it's really going to help him here, because Martin very rarely shoots takedowns. He only shoots perhaps 2 or 3 takedowns per fight. And if he does get the fight to the ground, Emeev is difficult to hold down. Emeev is one of these guys, has reasonably good takedown defense. He is difficult to hold down. So even if, Martin was able to shoot a takedown, not really sure how much success he's going to have. So this is a really competitive fight for me. If we look at the odds at the moment, I wouldn't bet Emeev at favourite odds, because like I said, he's a little bit too passive for me, and Rocco Martin's very good. So the question really becomes, is Rocco Martin worth a bet here? And, some guys will be like, whenever they see a guy at underdog odds, if they think it's going to be a close competitive fight, they will pull the trigger on the underdog, no question. And while I do think that this will be a competitive fight, I'm not sure if I can get to the implied probability. I'm not sure I can get to capping Martin at 50%, just because Emeev is a better striker. He does have home advantage. He does have the skills to keep the fight standing. Martin doesn't have the best fight IQ. Like I say, he doesn't shoot takedowns that often. He also struggles to put his stamp on rounds sometimes when fights are standing. So I do think that this fight will be close and competitive, but I'm not rushing out the bet on either guy here. I think this will be a competitive matchup. Even when Martin is a slight underdog, I don't feel like personally, there's any strong positions on this fight, so I would recommend passing on this one. Sorry to be boring, but again, I like money, and there's just no strong positions for me to put my money on this fight. So we now go into the next matchup that I want to talk about, which is going to be Ed Herman against Kattar Ibragimov. Now, while we are running through this fight, I will play one of Ibragimov's fights in the background. Here's the guy in the red gloves and all black shorts, just so you can kind of see a little bit of what he brings to the table here. This is fighting against Kazanchuk from back in March of this year. So, this was only sort of like 7 or 8 months ago. I'm sure that Ibragimov won't look a great deal different to what he looks here, although he is only 24 years old, so he is going to be making big improvements from fight to fight. So when I began to research this fight, Ed Herman was one of the first names that jumped out at me on this card as a potential bet, which may come as a surprise to a lot of you. It was certainly a surprise to me, because obviously Ed Herman is 39 years old, and it's not very often you will hear me say that a 39-year-old fighter might be a good bet. But to keep it 100% real with you, Ibragimov is just not very good. I mean, certainly on paper he looks good. He's 8-1. He's got lots of wins in decent promotions like M1 Challenge. He's a big, strong guy, and he's only young. He's going to be young. He's going to be hungry. He's going to be making big improvements from fight to fight. But unfortunately, in terms of skills, Ibragimov is just not very good. Very low-level, sloppy striker, weak offensive wrestler, and also a super low level on the ground. We actually made some money betting against Ibragimov in his UFC debut against Da Un Jung earlier this year, back in August. We bet on Da Un Jung to win, and he came through for us in a big way, which was very, very nice. We only took a small 1-unit gamble on Da Un Jung, but he was a very big underdog, so we hit a nice winner on Da Un Jung there. So that was, I guess, one of the reasons why I thought Herman might be a decent bet here, just because Ibragimov, like I say, he's got loads of weaknesses. Sloppy striking, low level on the ground, not the strongest wrestler. But unfortunately, there is absolutely no doubt about it. The father time has caught up with Ed Herman. When I went back and researched his recent fights, I just have some concerns with his current set of skills, which I do feel like Ibragimov may be able to exploit. So the biggest weakness that you can see in Ed Herman at the moment, if you go back and watch his recent fights, is that he is very slow, very flat-footed, very stiff. He fights with his hands low, chin up high and exposed, very, very slow, doesn't move his head much, and he's definitely there to be hit. And while from a technical point of view, Ibragimov is a very, very low level, he still hits very hard, he's still very aggressive, he's still a young, hungry guy. And that's the problem I've got with this fight. If we look at the odds on this fight, we've got Herman as a slight underdog, again, same as Martin, around about 2.30 for moneyline odds of plus 130 for an implied probability of 43%. So again, to be able to bet Herman here, you'd have to see this as a 50-50 fight to get any value. And then if we look at the odds on Ibragimov, currently around about a 1.63 favourite, which is minus 159 for an implied probability of 61%. So you'd want to be capping Ibragimov at 66 to 67% in this fight. So it's a tough one for betting for me, because there's no doubt that Ibragimov is very bad, but at the same time, like I say, he comes out the gate very aggressive, hits very hard. I'm not going to say he has knockout power, but, he hits hard, he's aggressive, and I can't help but feel that if he does come out aggressive, like he usually does in all of his fights, winging bombs, swinging for the fences, with Ed Herman being so flat-footed, with his striking defense being quite bad, with him being quite slow, there's a good chance that Ibragimov will connect and knock him out. It's very unfortunate, but at the same time, this is a very winnable fight for Ed Herman. I'm not going to write him off. For me, again, there are no strong positions here, because on one hand, the favourite Ibragimov is not very good. He's got big technical deficiencies everywhere. On the other hand, with Ed Herman, he's only a slight underdog, but his striking defense puts him at significant risk of being knocked out. So again, sorry to be boring, guys, but this is a very, very easy pass for me. There are just no good bets on this fight. So we now go into the next fight that I want to talk about in today's video, which is Alexander Volkanovski. It's not Volkanovski. We'll be talking about him next month, though, when he fights Max Holloway. Instead, this time we are talking about Alexander Volkov against Greg Hardy in a fight that everyone's talking about this week. I remember when this fight first got announced a few weeks back. Of course, Hardy stepping up to take this fight on short notice after beating Ben Cezzoli very recently. Now, everyone was talking about this fight. Everyone's looking forward to seeing Hardy lose. Everyone wants to see him get his ass kicked and knocked out. And when this fight was first announced, everyone was saying Volkov's going to murder him. Everyone's saying, they're betting Volkov. Volkov's a terrible matchup, etc., etc., etc. But over the last, couple of days, we have started to see the odds improve on Alexander Volkov a little bit. He reached his lowest to around 1.32, which would be minus 313. And now he is approaching 1.42 on one site, although, more than likely reaching 1.40 on most sites, which is around about minus 250. So money definitely coming in on Hardy. The odds definitely improving on Volkov, and it's quite interesting. Everyone thought Hardy was going to get his ass kicked. Everyone was looking forward to seeing Hardy getting beat up and knocked out, but it actually appears like the odds are moving in the other direction at the moment, and people are betting Greg Hardy. And after researching this fight, I can definitely see why. I can tell you right now that, there's no doubt that Volkov is better than Hardy everywhere. He's a more technical striker, throws a very nice, diverse range of strikes, decent boxer, very, very heavy kicks. And really, on the ground is where he's going to have a massive advantage here. Don't forget that it wasn't that long ago that Volkov was mixing it up on the ground with Fabrizio Verdum and certainly held his own. So Volkov, very dangerous on the ground. He'll be light years ahead of Hardy if this fight goes to the ground. Of course, the problem is Alexander Volkov. I need to stop saying that. Alexander Volkov, at 6'7" with an 81-inch reach, abnormally tall for the division, very long, rarely looks to take his opponents to the ground, so I'm expecting this to be a stand-up fight. And in a stand-up fight, there is no question that Volkov will have the advantage from a technical point of view. However, he does fight with his hands very low. He is quite slow. Many guys that are this size do tend to be slow. He doesn't move his head much. Again, like Herman, he is there to be hit. I mean, we've seen Derek Lewis absolutely death shot him in his last fight. We also saw Timothy Johnson basically kill him. He knocked him out standing like twice. It was actually a miracle that Volkov was able to survive this fight. And in actual fact, I think it was a bit of a robbery. I did score the fight in favour of Timothy Johnson, but Volkov is there to be hit, is the point that I'm trying to make, and Greg Hardy hits extremely hard. There are weaknesses in Greg Hardy's stand-up. He tends to overcommit to his strikes too much, which can leave him wide open to big counters. He also does turn, earlier on in his fights in the UFC, didn't do it against Cezzoli, but certainly against Smolyakov, Crowder, Rasheem Jones, Tabaris Johnson, Austin Lane, he could be seen turning his back on his opponent quite a lot, which would be a mistake against Volkov. But against Cezzoli, he did show that he'd improved his striking defense quite a bit, so maybe that's not an issue anymore. He's 31 years old, but he's young in his MMA career, training full-time at American Top Team, so I'm sure he's going to be making big improvements from fight to fight, and he is very fast. He is very big at 6'5". I mean, Volkov won't have a size or reach advantage here, really. He is very explosive. There is no doubt in my mind that Greg Hardy can land something big and hard on Volkov and knock him out. So if we look at the odds on this fight, like we said, the current average odds available on Volkov, 1.38, which is minus 263 for an implied probability of 72%. To get any value here on Volkov, you'd want to be better, or you'd want to give him around a 77% chance of winning, which is absolutely ludicrous. There's no way that you can cap him at those odds, because like I say, he is there to be hit. Hardy can land something big and knock him out. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So then the question becomes, do we consider betting on Greg Hardy at odds of 3.20, which is plus 220, which would give us an implied probability of 31%. A lot of people are betting on Greg Hardy here, and I can see why. I definitely can see why. I mean, personally, to get any value on Hardy at these odds, I think personally you should be capping him at around about 40%, and I'm not sure if you can do that. I mean, like I say, he's at a big disadvantage on the ground. It's also possible that he might have questionable cardio if you make him work, because of course he gassed out quite bad in the second round against Alan Crowder. Very inexperienced. This is a huge step up in competition for him. Volkov has had almost 40 pro fights. He's by far the toughest fighter Hardy's career. Volkov also has home advantage, and Volkov's got very decent cardio for a heavyweight. Decent chin and toughness as well. I mean, go back and watch the Tim Johnson fight that we mentioned a bit earlier on. Very, very tough. Difficult to put away. Decent chin despite the fact that he is there to be hit. And I mean, we haven't really seen how Greg Hardy responds to adversity. I mean, pretty much all of his fights so far have been pretty easy. Semi-squash matches. He's run through everyone quite easily. How is he going to react if he gets dragged into deep water, if he gets put on his back? How is he going to react if Volkov lands something big and hard on him? We don't even know how he can take a punch. So for me to cap him at 40% here, which is what I'd need to in order to bet him, is a bit of a stretch. There's no way I can bet Volkov because he's definitely there to be hit, and Hardy hits very hard. At the end of the day, it's suicide to bet on heavyweights at big favourite odds, because every heavyweight carries legit one-shot KO power. So again, this is an easy pass for me. I'm sorry to be boring, but there are just no strong positions on this fight. I am not going to criticise anyone taking a gamble on Hardy this weekend. I understand that some people have a very different risk tolerance to me. Some people don't aren't so risk averse. They won't look for as good a risk reward ratio as I would. I don't criticize anyone for betting Hardy. It's not personally for me. He can definitely win though. If you're seeing people out there say, Hardy's a bum, he's inexperienced, he's gonna get exposed, Volkov's gonna dominate him, that may happen. But at the same time, please bear in mind, from a stylistic point of view, Volkov is there to be hit, and Hardy can KO him for sure. There is no doubt in my mind. And now we go on to the final fight that I want to talk about in today's video, which is going to be Calvin Kattar against Zabit Magomed Sharipov. And I just want to make it clear that this is actually going to be a 3-round fight. Obviously, we are used to main events being 5 rounds, but this is going to be a 3-round fight between Zabit and Kattar. And Kattar is our boy, right? He has been an absolute money train for us over the last 18 months or so. We have bet on him in his last 2 fights. We bet on him to beat Ricardo Lamas, as you can see here. Put a very nice big 3-unit bet on him to beat Ricardo Lamas, and he came through for us in a very, very big way. And then we also bet even more on him to beat Chris Fishgold. We bet 5 units on him to beat Fishgold, and again, he won easily. So Kattar definitely in our good books. Kattar has come through for us in a big way, dating all the way back to this time last year when we bet on him to beat Fishgold. However, there is a saying in poker: you've got to know when to hold them, and you've got to know when to fold them. And I'm not sure if this is the right fight to bet Calvin Kattar in, because with this fight, the tricky part about betting Kattar in this matchup is we haven't really seen his takedown defense or ground game tested. If you go back and look at his record, the majority of guys that he has fought in the UFC have been strikers. Philly's a striker, Burgos a striker, Moicano's a striker. Now, Chris Fishgold and Ricardo Lamas are grapplers, but there's a big difference between their level of grappling and the level of grappling the Zabit is going to bring to the table. And I know many people will be talking about Lamas being a strong wrestler, but he really isn't. If you look at Ricardo Lamas's stats throughout his career in the UFC, he only completed 32% of takedowns that he attempted. So, Ricardo Lamas was always sold as a strong grappler, but in reality he wasn't. Remember, the footage doesn't lie. So there's a big difference from being able to defend takedowns and pop back up to your feet when you get taken down against guys like Fishgold and Lamas to taking on someone like Zabit Magomed Sharapov. And Kattar is a fighter that I rate very highly. You know, he's got a great chin, he's very tough, he's got cardio for days, excellent striking technique. I mean, legitimately one of the best boxers in the featherweight division, certainly the best jab in the featherweight division. Absolute razor sharp striking technique. He's superb. I'm very, very high on Kattar, but the problem is there is a huge unanswered question around his grappling. We really haven't seen his takedown defense tested. We don't know anything about his ground game, and I was so keen to learn more about his takedown defense and ground game that I went back and watched loads of his fights from CES, Combat Zone, even went all the way back to watch this fight against James Jones in Elite XC. And unfortunately, you know, even though this guy has had 23 pro fights, it just feels like he's fought a disproportionately high amount of strikers throughout his career. And no matter how much footage I watch on this guy, I really can't find much footage on his takedown defense and ground game truly being tested, which makes it really difficult to bet on him against Zabit, because we know Zabit is a very high level grappler. You know, great grappling control. You see his long limbs here, his long arms. You know, very, very tall for the division at 6'1". Does a great job of getting the body lock takedown, dragging people to the ground, using his long limbs to control his opponents on the ground. It could be a very, very difficult night for Calvin Kattar if he doesn't have the level of grappling required to survive on the ground with Zabit. And unfortunately, we don't have the footage to give us the answers as to whether he's going to be able to hang with Zabit on the ground, which does make this a very, very difficult fight to cap. So, from a betting point of view, it's a very difficult fight, because if we look at the odds on Zabit, he's currently around about a 1.36 favourite, which is minus 278 for an implied probability of 74%. To get any value on Zabit here, you'd have to cap him at about 80%, which is completely ridiculous. There's no way you can give him an 80% chance of winning against such talented, skilled opponent as Calvin Kattar, because trust me, if this fight stays standing, Kattar will have the advantage. I do give him an advantage when it comes to striking over Zabit Magomed Sharapov. You know, for me, Kattar is a way more technical striker. If he can keep this standing, it's going to be a tough matchup for Zabit. Question mark is the ground game, though. And if we look at the odds on Kattar, currently around about, call it a 3.40 underdog, which is plus 240 for an implied probability of 29%. If I were looking to bet Kattar this weekend, again, I would be looking to cap him at about 40% to get a nice decent margin over the betting sites. And that's tough for me. That is really tough, because, you know, if we know that Kattar's got amazing takedown defense and a solid ground game, I'd actually cap him at like 60-70% here, because if he could keep the fight standing, I think he could probably dominate. I mean, he's a significantly better striker than Zabit. The problem is, if this fight goes to the ground, if he doesn't have very good takedown defense, if he doesn't have a very good ground game, you probably couldn't even cap him at 10%, right? Because Zabit's an absolute nightmare on the ground. So this fight becomes a very, very complicated one for betting. And again, because I don't know anything about Kattar's takedown defense or ground game, I can't bet him. It's not for me. It really isn't for me. And of course, I'm not going to bet Zabit as a big favourite. It's just too much of a gamble. You know what they say, you can't make any assumptions about Kattar's ground game or takedown defense. Yes, in his past fights, he has shown flashes of good takedown defense against Fishgold, you know, in his last fight against Lamas. But assumptions are the mother of all fuck-ups, and it's not for me. It is not for me. You've got to know when to hold him, know when to fold him. Zabit's got home advantage on his side. You know, 3-round fight doesn't give Kattar much time to settle into a rhythm and get going. It's not for me. But it's similar to the Hardy bet, right? It's a big gamble. I'm not going to criticise anyone for betting Kattar this weekend. I won't criticise anyone for betting Hardy this weekend. Personally, it's not for me. I only like to put my money in strong positions, and so far on the fights that I've covered in this video, I don't think there are any strong positions on these fights, but I will keep digging for bets. I will keep pumping out these breakdown videos all week, and hopefully we can dig up a decent bet soon. I will, like I say, keep digging, keep working hard, keep researching all these fights, and hopefully a strong position to put our money will emerge before this weekend. So I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Really sorry I couldn't find any bets for you, but again, a big part of this game is staying disciplined, only putting your money in strong positions. Don't fall for the traps. Don't be tempted to force bets and put your money in weak positions. Keep it tight. Only put your money in strong positions. Use compound interest, and long term you will make money. So if you like this video, boys, please hit the like button below. Also subscribe if you haven't already. Take care everyone, and I'll be back with another breakdown video very, very soon.